Things off. It's so nice to have everyone here for Art at Noon, animated by Hope and Desire, 3 Black artists at the nation's Centennial. I'm Abby King, the Assistant Director of Adult Programs here at PAFA, and I'm so excited to welcome you all today. I want to take a moment before our introductions to acknowledge that the land on which we gather, or where I'm speaking to you all and where PAFA is, are the ancestral lands of the Lenape people, whose presence and resilience in Pennsylvania continues to this day. I also want to start the way I start most of our programs, with a huge thank you to PAFA members. Thank you all so much for supporting us today and every day. One of the reasons we can have free programs like this on a regular basis. So if you enjoy our programming and are considered joining, I'm going to drop a link to that in the chat momentarily. But welcome to even our non-members, our folks from far away. It's so great to have you here with us. Just some quick Zoom thoughts before I hand things over. Know that this program is being recorded. We've already had a request for where our programs go when they're finished, because we know not everybody can attend all of the Zoom programs. There's so much out in the world right now, so many great resources. So we are recording this and it will land on our YouTube channel within the week. So I'll drop a link to that momentarily in the chat. So if you can't be here for the rest of the program, know that you can check that out later. Our fantastic speaker today is going to be sharing their screen and presenting for the next 40 to 45 minutes. So we will have time at the end of the program. Please drop your questions in the chat and know that we'll be tackling those towards the end as well. We have some exciting events coming up that I want to make sure to share with everybody. This Thursday, we continue our series on new myths in Black and Indigenous art and film. So this section, this class is on feminine archetypes and aesthetics, part 1. So this is part 1 of 2 in our series. And I don't know if I have any film lovers on the call. We are going to be mainly discussing the films Crooklyn and Beast of the Southern Wild. You don't have to watch them to join the class, but just for anyone who might hear those names and get excited. And we will be talking about PAFA's exhibition, Taking Space, Contemporary Women Artists and the Politics of Scale. We also have an event that just went on the website that I want to make sure is on folks' radar. This is a conversation with PAFA's Curator of Contemporary Art, Jody Throckmorton, and Taking Space artist, Elizabeth Columba. So the event is called Representations in Paint and is on the evening of April 13th and is free to PAFA members. So we'd love it if you can join. I'll be dropping links again to those in the chat. So again, a big thank you for everyone for being here. It's now my pleasure to hand things over to my colleague, the Kenneth R. Woodcock Curator of Historical American Art and the Director for the Center of the Study of the American Artist, Dr. Anna O'Marley, who's going to introduce our speaker. Welcome, Anna.
Thank you, Abby, and welcome everyone. I am thrilled to welcome you back to Art at Noon. And like Abby, I would like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you today from the ancestral and unceded lands of the Lenni Lenape peoples. And I wish to acknowledge the Lenape people, past, present, and future, and their continuing presence in the homeland and the Lenape diaspora. As a scholar of American landscape, I believe it's particularly imperative for me to reckon with the very real legacies of settler colonialism, historically and today. And it's in that spirit that I offer this acknowledgement. And today we're going to be hearing from Dr. Buick about the Centennial exhibition of 1876 in Philadelphia, which is also bound up in colonial and imperial legacies, as well as violence over Native land, particularly in 1876. So we are so honored that Dr. Pai Buick is here to speak with us today. I have admired her work and scholarship for many years and recently reached out to her and was thrilled that she was willing to speak to us. And as this is the last day of Women's History Month, and we've had a bang up month here at PAFA, and we are just going to continue. Year 2020 was supposed to be the year of women, but we're just continuing it on to 2021 and 22. So please, I will tell you just a brief a bit about Dr. Buick, and then she will begin her discussion. Kirsten Pai Buick is professor of art history at the University of New Mexico, where she teaches in the areas of material and visual culture of the first British Empire, US art to 1940, African American art, representation of the American landscape, and representations of enslavement, and the history of women as patrons and collectors of the arts. And I was honored that she spoke to a class that I'm co-teaching with my fellow curators here at PAFA about women collectors in the arts. And I hope this will lead to a publication soon. She has published extensively on African American art and has been the recipient of numerous awards and fellowships, including the Smithsonian American Art Museum's Pre-Doctoral Fellowship and the Charles Gaius Bolin Fellowship at Williams College. In 2015, she was chosen as the 11th recipient of the prestigious David C. Driscoll Prize for Excellence in African American Art. Her book, Child of Fire, Mary Edmonia Lewis and the Problem of Art History's Black and Indian Subject, is published by Duke University Press. Her second book, In Authenticity, Kara Walker and the Eidetics of Racism, is in progress. So please join me in welcoming Kirsten Pai Buick today.
Good morning. It's morning for me. Good morning, everyone. And thank you so much, Anna and Abby, for having me. Again, it's always a pleasure and an honor to speak to your institution, to teach the material and visual culture inhabited by your institution or inhabited in your institution. And Philadelphia always has a soft spot in my heart because in the days before Amazon, it was Philadelphia booksellers where I got all my art books. So let's dive right in. This is a subject that is near and very dear to my heart. My first professor of US art was David Huntington, who did extensive work on the Columbian World's Exposition in Chicago in 1893. And so I've made World's Fairs a kind of a side interest and study of mine. And the title, Animated by Hope and Desire, 3 Black artists at the nation's centennial. You'll notice an asterisk next to Black, and that's because Edmonia Lewis was of African descent, but she was also Ojibwe. So just a little asterisk there. But during the Philadelphia Centennial of 1876, we know of at least 3 artists of African descent who were present, 2 as exhibitors and 1 as a visitor: Edward Mitchell Bannister, Mary Edmonia Lewis, and Henry Ossawa Tanner. Bannister and Lewis exhibited the best of their work. Bannister's landscapes, one of which won an exhibition prize that was almost forfeit when the judges realized he was Black, and Lewis's marble sculptures created in the neoclassical style, one of which was her monumental Death of Cleopatra. Tanner, whose family hoped that he would enter a practical trade, visited with the secret desire to one day become an artist. This was an extraordinary time in the development of the nation and in the history of African Americans who dared to enter the fine arts. Not always triumphant and oftentimes devastating, nevertheless, they left us all a legacy of which to be proud. And the inspiration for my title comes from Sylvia Wynter, who wrote, "Human beings are magical, bios and logos, words made flesh, muscle, and bone, animated by hope and desire. Belief materialized as deeds, deeds which crystallize our actualities. And the maps of spring always have to be redrawn again in undared forms." The quotation from Sylvia Wynter is appropriate for the massive harnessing of resources that it takes to put on a World's Fair, but also for the three artists who all found themselves in one way or another at the Philadelphia Exposition in 1876. On the screen is the incredible structure of the Crystal Palace. And on the left side of the image are the years of the 19th century World's Fairs. And the years in red denote Paris World Fairs. But 1851 is the first, the Crystal Palace exhibition. 1855, 1867, 1876 is Philadelphia. 1878, Paris. 1889, Paris. 1893, Chicago, my hometown. And in 1900, Paris once again, where W.E.B. Du Bois put on the photography exhibition around African-American excellence. And so World's Fairs happened around industrialization. And of course, Great Britain was the first nation to industrialize. And so they host the first major World's Fair. In terms of France and their proliferation of World's Fairs, those World's Fairs were funded in large part by their colonial and imperial exploits in Africa. The Crystal Palace was a cast iron and glass building originally erected in Hyde Park, London, England, to house the Great Exhibition of 1851. More than 14,000 exhibitors from around the world gathered in the palace's 990,000 square feet of exhibition space to display examples of the latest technology developed in the Industrial Revolution. Designed by Joseph Paxton, the Great Exhibition building was 1,851 feet long with an interior height of 108 feet. If the concept of the World's Fair saw the light of day in London in 1851, Paris wasted no time in reaching the forefront in the organization of this type of event. And as I said, you can see in red the World's Fairs that Paris hosted. And in each exhibition, in each international exhibition, the United States made a showing, a notable showing. At the Crystal Palace exhibition, for example, Hiram Powers' Greek slave was on display. And this is a rendering of how the statue was shown. And we'll see her again later in my talk, how the statue was shown at the World's Fair in London, behind a red velvet curtain. And this woman that Hiram Powers invented this narrative around in order to make her palatable. And she went on world tour. She was Greek, a recent victim of the Greek and Turkish wars, the 1820s. And here she's kidnapped, stripped naked, and being sold into slavery before lustful Turks. Right. And so he makes up this story to make her acceptable. And then you have the dichotomy of this red velvet curtain, nothing more sensual than red velvet. When she went to Hiram Powers' hometown of Cincinnati, there were separate viewing hours, one for women and children and one for men. So, and this is the International Exposition of Art and Industry in 1867. In Paris. It was the second World's Fair to be held in Paris from the 1st of April to the 3rd of November in 1867. A number of nations were represented at the fair. And following a decree of Emperor Napoleon III, the exposition was prepared as early as 1864. There were 50,226 exhibitors, of whom 15,000 were from France and her colonies. 6,176 exhibitors were from Great Britain and Ireland, and 703 were from the United States, and a small contingent was from Canada. And this exposition was kind of remarkable for its clocks and its timepieces. The first, one of the most renowned clockmakers were on display there. Eugene Farcot he exhibited several units. One of them is currently in the Roosevelt Hotel in New Orleans. It's a clock face whose inner mechanical movements are carved from solid onyx. And the United States contribution to Paris that year was Eastman Johnson's Old Kentucky Home, Negro Life at the South. This is also a painting about time, right? It's a painting about nostalgia. By 1867, it was a painting that was nostalgic for an old South. It was a painting about leisure time for enslaved people, the fruits of whose labors were not theirs, nor the children they sired. Time was not theirs, either dynastically in terms of wealth, nor was the future theirs. And so this became a kind of sentimental look at the quote unquote Old South, because Eastman Johnson painted this in Washington, D.C. These are D.C. homes, right, that he kind of retools to be reminiscent of My Old Kentucky Home, which was a minstrel song composed by Stephen Foster. So looking back on progress, this is the Arts and Industries main building at the Philadelphia Centennial. After a contentious election in which Republicans disputed returns in Louisiana, South Carolina, and Florida, after 3 months of uncertainty and growing panic nationwide, but most importantly in the business community, and with fears of a renewed war between North and South, the Democrats would eventually yield the presidency to Rutherford B. Hayes. Sounds familiar, right? Horrible echoes of today. In the Compromise of 1877, the Democrats received a share of federal appointments, including a cabinet appointment, federal assistance to Southern railroads, and by then a largely symbolic removal of federal troops from Southern states. The resulting agreement cleared the way for the removal of African Americans from national and local politics and the collapse of the Republican Party in the South. It was officially the end of Reconstruction and the beginning of the nation's industrial age. And the nation threw itself a birthday party. This is from Frank Leslie's illustrated, and it's the Historical Register of the Centennial Exposition of 1876. World's fairs were about national, racial, technological, and moral supremacy, both on the domestic front and the global. And if you notice in this illustration, only two people or two figures stand erect. The United States, no longer represented by an indigenous woman, but now represented by a white woman, who shows Europe that the future is America. Behind them is a globe, Europe and Africa. You see Asia, whose back is bent, and we know her as representative of the continent, the ideological continent of Asia, because there's no such thing, there's Eurasia, right? But here she stands with her back bent, also peering into the future, which is America, and a cowering figure of a Native American who kneels and looks up at the authoritative figure of a white female allegorical representation of America, and Africa, and here embodied by a woman, like all the continents are, but who kneels and rears back in astonishment at the glimpse of its future in the coming American century. And here's an image of opening day at the Philadelphia Exposition, May 10, 1876. The Centennial celebration displayed the nation's achievements in industry, science, agriculture, and the arts. It opened on 450 acres in Fairmount Park. 10 million people from every state and more than 30 countries visited over the next 6 months of operation. And here's a bird's eye view of the exposition and the Centennial buildings. The major exhibition buildings were gigantic. In a still largely rural nation, Agricultural Hall covered more than 10 acres. Inside, visitors marveled at the latest mowing and reaping machines. But the centerpiece of the exposition was the 700-ton, 40-foot-high, coreless double walking beam engine, which generated 1,400 horsepower, enough to drive all the other machines in the enormous hall, powered by a steam boiler in an adjacent building and running almost silently. The engine was an awesome creation, representing in the beauty of its motion, design, and power, the very essence of the new industrial age. The torch of the Statue of Liberty was also on view at the Centennial. As the slide states, the Statue of Liberty's torch here on display at the Philadelphia Centennial. The sculpture was made by Frédéric Auguste Bartholdi of France, and in 1872, Bartholdi used his American contacts to assist in creating the Franco-American Union in Paris, which raised 400,000 francs to fund the construction of the statue. And on the left, what you see is a stereograph card. And in the 19th century, people would buy these little machines, these little devices, and they'd load the cards in and they'd see the image in 3 dimensions. We had those toys when I was a kid, but this was a kind of armchair tourism that was very exciting in the 19th century. It is ironic that at the end of Reconstruction and the beginning of an era that would see the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, the reversal of any rights that African Americans had gained, the institutionalization of Jim Crow, and untold thousands of Black people who were lynched, that France's promised gift, the torch from the Statue of Liberty, was exhibited at the fair. It is doubly ironic that a statue that was to herald the end of enslavement would instead become the symbolic light to clear the path of millions of European immigrants to our shores. In volume 2 of the 3rd edition of Who Built America? Working People and the Nation's History, the authors note, some Americans, however, were less enthralled by the sights, grandeur, pomp, and sense of marvel at the Centennial Exposition. They viewed it less as a celebration of the nation's achievements than as a diversion from hard and bitter daily reality. Neglected and sometimes stifled by the lavish festivities, these so-called other Americans, women, African Americans, American Indians, and workers, raised issues that would resonate far into the future. In the Centennial Women's Pavilion, paid for with contribution, end of quote, sorry. In the Centennial Women's Pavilion, paid for with contributions from across the country, they were to present visitors with crafts, inventions, and institutions established and conducted by women, with the glaring exception of women's suffrage. They decided to focus instead on the private domestic sphere to the exclusion of first-wave feminists and abolitionists. Moreover, African-American women who had helped raise funds for the Centennial were excluded entirely from the Women's Pavilion. Visitors, however, were treated to African Americans doing menial tasks or performing in the Southern restaurant, where, as the guidebook described it, quote, a band of old-time plantation darkies sing their quaint melodies and strum the banjo, end of quote. Frederick Douglass, who had been invited to sit on the opening day speakers platform, but not invited to speak, was almost stopped from ascending the stage because a policeman was convinced that no Black man would have been invited to sit among the dignitaries. Mind you, when Douglass attended the Columbian World's Exhibition in Chicago in 1893, he was only allowed to be there as the ambassador to Haiti. As for First Nations people, the Smithsonian had mounted a massive centennial exhibit of Indigenous artifacts comprised of pottery, teepees, totem poles, and life-sized costumed mannequins. They were deemed exterminated. They were deemed a museum people. This, however, was belied by the news of July 1876, when word reached the Centennial of the military victory of the Sioux and Cheyenne warriors at the Battle of Little Bighorn in Dakota Territory, where General George Custer and more than 200 US Army soldiers perished. Many white visitors viewing the material artifacts of destroyed Indigenous cultures shared the feelings of novelist William Dean Howells, who wrote, "The red man as he appears in effigy and in photograph in this collection is a hideous demon, whose malign traits can hardly inspire any emotion softer than abhorrence," end of quote. In 1876, Austrian artist Francesco Pezzicar, his statue of the freed slave was first exhibited. The statue was returned to Italy when Pezzicar could find no buyers. It was transferred to the Curatorio del Museo Revoltella at Pezzicar's death, where it remains on display until this day. And for Frank Leslie's historical register, Fernando Miranda made the engraving that you see on the right. Although African Americans were generally unwelcome at the Centennial, one exhibit attracted a great deal of interest among Black visitors to the fair: the statue by the Austrian artist Francesco Pezzicar, his monument to the abolishment of enslavement. And he holds aloft the Emancipation Proclamation and wears on his wrist broken chains and a piece of fabric more reminiscent of North Africa than it is a loincloth. Or anyway, the work received a gold medal, but white commentators were quick to criticize Pezzicar's work. And as I said, the artist failed to secure a buyer. But it makes a nice pendant, I think, to Lady Liberty's torch. And here's an example of the Italian display of painting and sculpture in the art annex. And what I want you to picture is the Centennial organizers sending out hundreds of commissioners who were tasked with locating artists and finding works to send back to Philadelphia. And that'll become important when I tell you about Edmonia Lewis. And we know all the names of the works on the wall and the artists, the names of the artists and the names of the sculptures. Henry Tanner, visitor to the Centennial. And on the left is his painting of the Annunciation from 1898, which is, it straddles that period for him between Orientalism. He'd been funded to travel to Palestine by Wanamaker, and he tried to recreate the interiors he felt that would have existed during biblical times. He later goes on to a kind of experimental brushwork of high modernism, but this is a very distinct and distinctive period in his career. Born into a prominent middle-class Black family in Pittsburgh, the Tanner family moved to Philadelphia in 1868, where his father was appointed the editor of the Christian Recorder, the weekly journal of the African Methodist Episcopal Church. His father would eventually become bishop of the AME Church. In 1877, Tanner was named the valedictorian of his grammar school, and from there apprenticed to a family friend in the flower business. But by 1878, severe respiratory illness kind of dictated that he leave that apprenticeship, and he gained parental permission to pursue a career as an artist. And I like to think that it was his tour of the Centennial that inspired him. It certainly prefigured an encounter he would have later that I'll tell you about. This is the Tanner family. And his sister Hallie, pictured here, Hallie Tanner Dillon Johnson, was an American physician who in 1891 became the first female African-American doctor in Alabama. And I'd like to use this opportunity to tell you a little bit about Hallie Johnson. She was born in Pittsburgh, the oldest daughter of 9 children to Benjamin Tucker and Sarah Elizabeth Tanner. Johnson was well educated, and as a young girl became familiar with the work of prominent African-American intellectuals. She worked with her father on the Christian Recorder, where a publication of the AME Church, where he ministered. Around the time of her graduation, African-American educator Booker T. Washington, founder of the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, had written to the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania to request a nomination for a teaching position he had been struggling to fill for 4 years. He hoped to find an African-American physician to serve the school and its surrounding community. Johnson accepted Washington's offer of $600 a month, including lodging and meals, and arrived to begin her service in August of 1891. In 1886, she married Charles Dillon, and the couple had a child before her husband's sudden death. And there's their daughter right there. A widow at 24, Johnson returned to live with her family and decided to enter medical school. After 3 years of study at the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania, she earned her medical degree in 1891, graduating with honors. And so she was there because of her parents' support. She was there to meet the need of the Tuskegee Institute. Before beginning her new job, Dr. Dillon had to face a significant obstacle, passing the Alabama State Medical Examination. The very fact that she was sitting for the examination caused a public stir in Montgomery, Alabama. She spent 10 days taking the exam, addressing a different area of medicine each day. Her examiners included the directors and leading figures of most of the state's major medical institutions. Dillon impressed them with her responses, and she passed the test. Dr. Dillon was the first woman to practice medicine in the state of Alabama. During her brief tenure at Tuskegee, she was responsible for the health care of the school's 450 students and 30 faculty and staff. She also established a training school for nurses and founded the Lafayette Dispensary to serve the healthcare needs of local residents, often mixing medicines herself for their use. She also taught 2 classes each day. And here I am complaining about Zoom and the fact that I don't know how to get dressed anymore. In terms of her personal life, her tenure at Tuskegee ended in 1894 when she married the Reverend John Quincy Johnson, an African Methodist Episcopal minister and math instructor at Tuskegee. The couple moved first to Columbia, South Carolina, where he became president of Allen University, a private school for Black students. They later moved to Hartford, Connecticut, and then from there to Atlanta, Georgia, and then to Princeton, New Jersey, as Reverend Johnson pursued undergraduate and graduate degrees in theology. Finally, in 1900, the couple settled in Nashville, Tennessee with their 3 children, and Reverend Johnson became the pastor of St. Paul AME Church. Unfortunately, Hallie Johnson died in Nashville from complications during childbirth. And I think it's important to think about her career and think about the start that she got in in Pennsylvania, because Pennsylvania was responsible for so much medical history. The medical history of this country is intimately intertwined with Pennsylvania. And then we have this example. Tanner may have seen, more than likely saw, Thomas Aiken's The Gross Clinic, which was exhibited in the ward of Model Post Hospital, the medical department at the Philadelphia Centennial. And in December of 1879, 3 years after his visit to the Centennial, Tanner begins his studies at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts with Aikens. And he remained a student there sporadically through 1885. And here is a detail of the painting. And here on the right is how it looked installed in this model hospital. Now, art historians who study the US are always looking for their quote unquote European moment. And the seeming rejection of Aikens's painting from the art display gives them the salon de refuse tingles all day long, right? Oh, the public just doesn't understand the greatness of this artist. But I think it does belong in the medical display. I think it was appropriately displayed there. But one of the things I want to point out is this figure of the chaperone, or the woman here, or who may perhaps be a mother or a chaperone to the young boy who's being operated on. And I want to take a brief detour into the visual language of sentimentalism, which so much of what we've looked at so far is engaged in. In her book, Sentimental Materialism, Laurie Marish argues, according to the popular antebellum doctrine, influence was a form of authority exercised on the passions rather than reason, which operated through persuasion instead of force. By appealing to an individual's love of virtue, influence engaged and subtly directed his or her affections. And I want to locate here the power of women, which was not the power of the head, but it was the power of the gut and the power of the heart. And the idea that feminine influence, a kind of passive power of influence, is localized and activated not by the reason, but by the emotions. And so in the Aikens painting of Dr. Gross, you see the feeling woman and the thinking man, right? The light that shines on his scalpel, which he holds like a pen, the light that shines on the dome, the great dome of his forehead, and the cowering, irrational woman who cannot possibly understand reason and science, belied, of course, by the story I just told you of Henry Ossawa Tanner's sister. But there is a visual language of sentimentalism, this strict binary of the feeling woman and thinking man. And nowhere is that better expressed than PFA's own Charles Wilson Peale's self-portrait, The Artist in His Museum of 1822, where Peale performs this gesture of a magician removing the curtain from his museum, or as Apollo, the god of light and enlightenment, as he reveals on the one side of the museum the great mastodon, the bones of the mastodon, which represent prehistory, and the order and taming of nature represented by the left side of the canvas, where birds have been abstracted. They've been taxonomied and reinstalled in this strict hierarchy and order. One side of the museum representing reason, the other side representing irreason. I know that's not a word, but you get the idea. But if you look further into the canvas, you see this binary of the feeling woman who turns her back on the order and the organization of the museum, and instead makes this gesture of pre-language and pre-thought as she gapes at the bones of the mastodon. And here, expressing nurture over nature, an adult male turns the young boy away from the bones of the mastodon and towards the reason and order of the rational world, the world of history, the world of science. And then a fully adult man who looks firmly away from the bones of the mastodon and towards the museum's technology of order, that the museum that tames nature and brings it under the sovereignty of reason. And I wanted to show you this photograph. I always show this to my students. Out of the thousands, the tens of thousands of photographs that Pete Souza, and of the hundreds of photographs he no doubt took of this moment when Hillary Clinton as Secretary of State, Barack Obama as President, Joe Biden as Vice President are sitting in the Situation Room, May 1, 2011, anniversary of the opening of the Philadelphia Centennial, watching the raid that killed Osama bin Laden. They choose this photograph, the photograph where Hillary Clinton responds in a way that is highly binary, highly gendered. And so I asked the question, how do women look? Right? How do women look? We'll come back to this. Edward Mitchell Bannister, exhibitor at the Centennial. He was born in New Brunswick, Canada, and by 1850, Bannister was listed in the Boston Census as a resident. He worked as a barber, as a photographer, and eventually was known for his landscapes. And they were landscapes reminiscent of an earlier French style of painting from the Barbizon school. Bannister's landscapes relied on their drama, not for the subject matter, which tended to be serene, but from his brushwork. The drama was in the brushwork. The appearance of rapidity and spontaneity in the application of paint was the hallmark of 19th century modernism. In 1854, he received his first commission for a seascape from Dr. John DeGrasse, who was an African-American physician, here shown in his army uniform. From 1863 to 1865, Bannister studied with William Rimmer, a physician and sculptor, at the Lowell Institute in Massachusetts. Until 1865, Bannister advertised in newspapers as a photographist, until he met this woman, 10 years his senior, Christiana Carteau. She was born Christiana Babcock in 1819 in North Kingstown, Rhode Island. She was born to African-American and Narragansett Indian parents. She was a descendant of enslaved Africans who worked the plantations of South County, Rhode Island during the 18th century. As a young woman, she moved to Boston, where she worked as a wig maker and hairdresser. In 1853, Christiana and Edward Mitchell Bannister met when he applied for work as a barber in her Boston salon. They married June 10, 1857, and Bannister attributed his success to her financial and emotional support, as well as her critical eye and business sense. In 1869, the Bannisters moved to Providence, Rhode Island, and Christiana continued her business as a hairdresser, as well as her activism. For example, during the Civil War, Christiana Carteau Bannister was an advocate for equal pay for Black soldiers, and in November of 1864, she organized a fair sponsored by the Boston Colored Ladies Sanitary Commission to benefit the African-American regiments, the 54th and 5th Massachusetts regiments, who served for a year and a half without pay rather than accept less than the white soldiers were paid. In Providence, she founded the home for aged colored women when she learned about the struggles of African-American women who worked as domestics, but who were too old to work and often became homeless. The home moved from Transit Street to Dodge Street and was renamed Bannister House. Another remarkable woman. Once in Rhode Island, the Bannisters flourished, and he flourished in particular. He served on the original board of directors for the Rhode Island School of Design and was a founding member of the Providence Art Club, where he regularly exhibited until 1899. But back to the Centennial. Bannister won one of 4 first prize medals and a certificate for a painting that is still lost, but that we know is titled Under the Oaks. And there's his certificate and the surviving sketch. He almost didn't receive his due, however, once the judges realized he was Black. And here's his interview with the New York Tribune. I hurried to the committee rooms to make sure that the report of my award was true. There was a great crowd there ahead of me. As I jostled among them, many resented my presence, some actually commenting within my hearing in a most petulant manner, "What is that colored person in here for?" and similar discourteous remarks. The official in charge was very insolent. He demanded in the most exasperating tone of voice, "Well, what do you want here anyway? Speak lively." I responded, "I want to inquire concerning number 54. Is it a prize winner? What's that to you?" Controlling myself, I said deliberately, "I painted the picture." An explosion could not have made a more marked impression. Without hesitation, he apologized, and soon everyone in the room was bowing and scraping to me. And here's an example of, I think, one of his most beautiful paintings, Sunset. And this is what Bannister says about the artist. The artist becomes an interpreter of the infinite, subtle qualities of the spiritual idea centering in all created things. The goal of the artist is to expound for us the laws of beauty, and so far as finite mind and executive ability can, reveal to us glimpses of the absolute idea of perfect harmony. By the time that Centennial commissioners were dispersed throughout the US and Europe to locate and send to Philadelphia works by prominent artists, Edmonia Lewis had been living and working in Italy since 1865. In an interview, she said that when the commissioner chose her monumental sculpture of the death of Cleopatra, she wept unashamedly. And this is one of the only known photographs of the original appearance of Lewis's Cleopatra. The photograph was taken in 1878 in Chicago, where the statue moved after failing to sell at the Philadelphia Exposition. And the choice to represent Cleopatra was a bold one, in part because of the function of neoclassical sculpture in the 19th century. And if you remember, I showed you how the Greek slave was displayed in 1851, but she really does sum up the function of neoclassical sculpture. It was supposed to be moral. So it was supposed to tell a story of morality, and it was supposed to have a national significance, and it was supposed to be modern. Thus, Hiram Powers updates the Venus Pudica pose and updates the story, updates the narrative around the sculpture. And here's an example of how those sculptures could be put to use. Joseph Rhodes Buchanan's System of Anthropology, his outlines of lectures on the neurological system of anthropology, he chooses Hiram Powers' sculpture to demonstrate the health benefits, for example, of uncorseted waists. But he also shows you the region of animality, so that the largeness of your calves say something about you. The region of virtue and love, the size of your breasts say something about you. The size of your behind speaks to your ability to hate, your capacity to hate. And also the region of insanity, located in the regions the region of the genitalia. And so these sculptures were instructive. They could be used for medical illustrations. They could also be used to point out racial differences. Profiles were incredibly important indicators of intelligence and capacity and behavior. The human body was turned into a legible and open book. Now, I showed you the Apollo before in the context of Charles Wilson Peele, but here J.C. Knott and George Glidden use the sculpture to create a fictional skull to show you comparative facial angles. The European, of course, descended from the gods, from ancient Greek sculpture, and the straightness of the facial angle indicates intelligence. That compared to a Negro, as it's called, and you see the skull, the canted angle of the profile, that compared to a young chimpanzee. And so facial angles, profiling, we get the term profiling from this concept, the indications of character. And so Lewis, in Contending with Cleopatra, entered a debate that was alive, right? Alive in terms of race, alive in terms of questions of women's character. William Wetmore Story, who modeled one of the most famous Cleopatras of the 19th century in 1858, gives us a Cleopatra that to a 19th century eye read as African, read as sub-Saharan African. Thomas Ridgway Gould, on the other hand, gives us a Cleopatra whose profile was read as Aryan. And these debates around Cleopatra's race had to do with debates around enslavement and African ability. And so abolitionists tended to side with the idea that Cleopatra was of African descent, that she was Black African, and that her ability to rule a nation was indicative of African potential should we abolish enslavement. Gould, on the other hand, sided with those who said that Cleopatra was a descendant of the Ptolemy. She was Greek. She was not African. And African people could not be capable of such feats as maintaining an empire and subduing at least 2 Roman emperors. Now, Cleopatra also had a reputation as promiscuous and manipulative, using her influence, thanks to Shakespeare, to control men. Why would African American women want to be associated with Cleopatra? I'm going to show you how Lewis kind of escapes the debate. And so what Lewis gives us is a very studied end to the story. There is William Wetmore Story's Cleopatra, who's alive, very much alive and contemplating death. Thomas Ridgway Gould's Cleopatra, who's in the process of dying. We see death literally moving through her body. And it's indicated by this arm, which in art history you learn is the death arm. This is the arm that signifies death. You see it in images of Christ who's been taken down from the cross. We know this arm is the death arm. And so the right side of her body is already dead. And we see death moving to the left side of her body. And then Edmonia Lewis, who gives us a Cleopatra who is dead. She is very thoughtful and deliberate in how she answered the 2 previous sculptures by male artists, white male artists. Now, the question of Cleopatra's race could be easily answered by painters in that they could choose to depict a white-skinned Cleopatra with darker-skinned servants. Now, the reason that this becomes an issue is because Cleopatra is the historical answer to the biblical question of enslavement and the rightness of enslavement. Sarah Bernhardt, who toured, Cher, who like Sarah Bernhardt, gives this 30-year-long exit tour or farewell tour, would play Cleopatra and darken her skin and wear wigs made of coarse wool. And I found a review in The Nation magazine complaining that Sarah Bernhardt had smudged herself up, and we know for a fact that Cleopatra was Aryan. This review was published in 1863 at the heart of the Civil War. And then we have Liz Taylor's contribution in 1963, where in the background we have what's clearly supposed to represent sub-Saharan Nubian slaves to a white Cleopatra. So the debates about Cleopatra's race are as ignorant as our ideas about race, that somehow race transcends history and that to be Black was the same in the BCE era as it is today. But the nose knows, right? This is how Edmonia Lewis answered. She gives us a Cleopatra that's archaeologically correct. And that's why that photo that remains of her Cleopatra is so important, because it shows us the aquiline nose of her Cleopatra. Living and working in Rome, she had access to the Vatican Museum's collections, and she modeled the nose on the historically, archaeologically correct Cleopatra. Unfortunately, with the restoration in the mid-90s, the nose was shaved down. But I close as I began with Sylvia Wynter. Human beings are magical. Bios and logos, words made flesh, muscle and bone animated by hope and desire, belief materialized as deeds, deeds which crystallize our actualities. And the maps of spring always have to be redrawn, again, in undared forms. Even as the exposition spoke of the rivalries, local, national, and global, they managed to harness vast amounts of resources that sought to encapsulate past, present, and the potential of the future. Though seeking to be encyclopedic, they were never inclusive in the ways that we understand inclusivity to function. But something can be said about the Centennial and the internal strife and striving that it exposed between more conservative women and those who were in the vanguard of feminist action, between the fair officials and the most derided members of the nation, around whom questions of citizenship and belonging still swirled, about a nation that, through constant struggle and activism and protest, is held to account and forced to live up to its principles. A great deal of work remains to be done, but it can't be done if we won't listen. And so I thank you for allowing me to share with you a window into my interest in World's Fairs. And thank you for allowing me to share the stories of some amazing women, such as Hallie Tanner Johnson, Christiana Bannister, and Mary Edmonia Lewis. Women who can answer definitively the question of how do women look? Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Kirsten. That was amazing. And I know there may be some questions. I know we're right near 1 o'clock. If you have a few minutes, I'd love people to be able to write their questions in the chat. And just to get people going, I was really struck by your discussion of the language of sentimentalism. And I wondered, this is probably too big a question, but how you thought Edmonia Lewis tapped into that language of sentimentalism.
By broaching the sculpture of Cleopatra at all, and throughout her works, where she always chooses, in terms of her representations of African Americans and First Nations people, only those happiest moments within the line of their sentimental narratives. And so when she references Longfellow, for example, she doesn't show the death, the very sentimental death of Minnehaha, or the disappearance of Hiawatha when he realizes the Europeans are coming. She chooses love and marriage. Now with Cleopatra, I think it's a clever escape hatch because, as I said, African-American women would not necessarily want to be associated with Cleopatra, with the character of Cleopatra that has come down to us since, you know, the victors always get to tell the stories of the losers. Cleopatra was known as this licentious, promiscuous, you know, Egypt as trap house, right? African American women had enough trouble with questions around their own sexuality. And in 1863, that was the first year that an African American woman could actually bring a charge of rape against a white man. And it's the Lieber codes, and it's kind of the negotiations around the Civil War. The New York Times did a very interesting article on those Lieber codes and what it meant to say that it wasn't until 1863 that an African American woman could be raped in the eyes of the law.
Thank you for that.
But she was constantly negotiating the traps of sentimentalism. I'm sorry, I'm reading the chats. Someone asked, why was Cleopatra's nose shaved down? Because we only had that one extant photograph, and the conservator just didn't know any better. I asked that, you know, once the Smithsonian took charge of the sculpture, that we use the shadow in the photograph to reconstruct the nose. There is enough information there, and we have enough information on the record. 19th century viewers of the sculpture said she looked Jewish, that Lewis's Cleopatra was Jewish because of the aquiline nose. And so we have a written record, and we have enough information in the photograph, I think, to have ensured that the nose not be shaved down. Hopefully they'll go back into the sculpture and fix it. It's not too late.
It's never too late. Thank you for that. We have a question from Mark Liss in the chat asking if there was an inventory of the works that Edmonia Lewis exhibited at the Centennial, and specifically that piece that they're looking for by Thomas, that was purchased by Thomas Haynes Dudley.
Mm-hmm. Oh, what work was that was purchased by him? And we do have a list. There, she had several works in the art annex. Awake and Asleep were there, and some other works. We do have a list. I'm saying your last name, but you can email me and we can have an exchange, Mr. Liss. Yes. Oh, the bust. I know the bust of Abraham Lincoln. Are you talking about the one with the caryatids around it and the two soldiers behind, or a different bust? Because there's one in San Francisco and there's one in a collection that it shouldn't be there, but we can talk. We can talk.
Thank you. So uncovering some mysteries, it sounds like. We have reached our time. And so if there aren't any other questions, I wanted to have a huge thank you for all of you for being with us. And of course, to our amazing scholar, Dr. Buick, thank you so much for sharing your research and scholarship. And I'm so excited to hopefully work with you in the future. This has just been
a pleasure. And I'll go through the chat and I'll see if there are any other questions I can answer.
Thank you so much, Kirsten.
It was a pleasure.
If people want to unmute to say goodbye, you can do that.
We love to hear from you.
Fantastic lesson.
Thank you for being here. Thank you. I felt all your warmth.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.